I used to think the monarchy would go on forever somehow or another, and I no longer do. The great Victorian journalist Walter Bagehot said, "Don't let the daylight in on the magic," as far as the monarchy was concerned. Well, once Prince Charles's marriage to Lady Di had split up, and Princess Anne got divorced, and then Prince Andrew came along with this ridiculous wife, Fergie, it was impossible not to let daylight in on the magic, and the magic vanished, I'm afraid. And although the king has done his best in his old age with the coronation ceremony and all that to try and make the monarchy seem magic again, it never will be again. And this story, this Epstein story, and the photo of Prince Andrew kneeling over this unfortunate person lying on the floor somewhere, whether it's in Paris or New York, it doesn't really matter where it is. And now the story today about Fergie going to see Epstein with her daughters, only days after he'd been let out of prison for very serious offences. This taints the royal family. To quote the great Lord Mandelson, it's like dog muck. It's never going to go away, the stench of this.
Should we assume that there is nothing actually, in a historical context, nothing unusual about Andrew's behaviour, nothing unusual about Sarah Ferguson's behaviour in a historical context? The difference is now this stuff leaks. We know about it. We see it.
What I'm saying.
We see him bent
There
over
isn't a great difference in the way people behave. And certainly when you think, as I say, of George IV or William IV or Charles II with his string of mistresses who ended up as duchesses and things, there isn't a great difference in the way the royal family has behaved. There's a huge difference in the way we, the press, the journalists and the public, want the royal family to be. And we want to have this image. We don't worship politicians. We don't think of them as squeaky clean and pure. But we, think of the outpouring of genuine grief for the Queen, because she seemed almost like a saint.
Yeah. But so when there have been troublesome royals in the past, what methods have been used to remove them from public life, short of, the obvious chopping block?
Well, the closest we've had to a chopping block in relatively recent history was the abdication, when Edward VIII was sacked. He could easily have stayed on, and, if necessary, married a divorced woman. He should have just said, I'm changing the rules. He's the boss. But
as indeed our current king is.
He changed the rules. Yeah. And I think what happened in the case of Edward VIII, everybody knew he was very dodgy on lots of levels. He was probably being blackmailed by the Nazis. He certainly was pro-Nazi. And later, the stuff that's emerged about the kind of remarks he was making to the Germans when the war broke out, saying that, if only they bombed London, they would crush the spirit of the British and they'd assassinate George VI and put Edward VIII. I mean, once that emerged, we realised they were right to sack him in 1936. But the alleged reason for sacking him was that he wanted to marry an American divorcee.
Look, so on Times Radio yesterday, Chris Philp suggested that Andrew should be removed from the line of succession. Is there any historical or legal precedent for doing that?
I think it would be extremely difficult to do that.
I mean, presumably, I guess, when Edward abdicated, he was kind of removed from the line of succession. You can only do that once you get to the top.
He was removed, yes. Yeah. And also had a miracle occurred and Mrs. Simpson had a baby. That wouldn't have been in the line of succession. But I think it would be very difficult. I mean, assuming that nothing happens to the children of Kate Middleton and Prince William, but it is conceivable a bomb to be thrown or something like that, then Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, Mr. Windsor, would be the King of England. And that would be the end of the monarchy. There's no question about that. What
about this idea that he could be compelled to give testimony to Congress? Is there any precedent for that sort of thing?
No. And I don't know what testimony he would give, quite honestly, because I think it would be a bit of theatre. But I think they're going to do it, don't you? I mean, if they got we've just been listening, the Clintons are going. I think
I shouldn't think they'll send him over. I can see him doing some kind of video link.
They'll make him do it on Zoom, a video link.
Wow, yeah.
You see, as a game, will have the most appalling effect on the way the British regard their monarchy in general. Even though we know the King's done everything he can to strip this person of his titles, etc., 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 it all reflects back on the royal family in general.
For all the damage it does, how bad do things have to get before we don't have a monarchy? Because, I mean, you'd think we've got to get a good deal worse than this before people had actually finally had enough.
I mean, if they were had out for murder or something of the kind. But the point is, you're missing out one rather key ingredient. who would want to be the monarch
Yeah.
with all this going on? And, there are quite strong signs that Prince William only half wants to be the monarch.
Yeah, sure.
And, if I were Prince George, I'd be already saying, Dad, I do not want to do this job.
Do you think then, in 100 years' time, when we look back at the history of the monarchy in the 20th and 21st century, right now, this will be considered as significant as anything else?
I do, because I used to think the monarchy would go on forever somehow or another, and I no longer do.
Wow. Ian Wilson, thank you very much indeed. Great pleasure having you here, as always.
Great to see you.
The monarchy will no longer go on forever. There was a time when the institution seemed immovable, as permanent a fixture of the British landscape as the Thames or the Tower of London itself. But that comfortable certainty has begun to crack, and what emerges from the fissures is a question far more unsettling than any Republican argument. Who, in their right mind, would actually want the job? The modern monarchy faces not the threat of revolution or ideological opposition, but something far more corrosive, the simple, practical problem of recruitment. A crown has become less a symbol of power than a guarantee of relentless scrutiny, constrained freedom, and the burden of embodying a nation's expectations, whilst your every move is dissected by tabloids and television cameras. The young royals know this intimately. They have watched their lives become public property, their mistakes magnified, their private sorrows broadcast to millions. So, when we ask whether the monarchy will survive, we are really asking whether the sacrifice it demands will ever seem worthwhile again to those expected to make it. And that, perhaps, is a question the institution cannot easily answer. The monarchy will no longer go on forever. There was a time when Wilson held an almost unshakable conviction that the monarchy would persist indefinitely, sustained by centuries of tradition and the sheer weight of institutional inertia, that it would simply carry on, generation after generation, much as it always had. Yet this comfortable assumption has become increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of contemporary reality. The public's relationship with the Crown has undergone a marked transformation, no longer characterized by the deference and automatic reverence of previous eras. Simultaneously, the very institutions that once stood as bulwarks of monarchical power have begun to shift their positions, their attitudes subtly but unmistakably altered. What was once taken as a given, that the monarchy would endure as a natural and permanent feature of the British landscape, can no longer be accepted with such certainty. The world has changed around the institution, and with it, so too have the assumptions we carry about its future. The monarchy will no longer go on forever. At the heart of the contemporary monarchy crisis lies a deceptively simple yet profoundly unsettling question. What possible motivation could drive a rational person to pursue the crown, or indeed to accept it when offered? This fundamental interrogation strikes at the very essence of why the institution persists at all. Historically, the answer seemed self-evident: power, prestige, dynastic obligation, divine right. But these justifications have become increasingly hollow in an age that prizes individual autonomy, personal fulfillment, and democratic values. The disconnect between what monarchy demands of its subjects, deference, pageantry, the subordination of private life to public duty, and what contemporary culture celebrates, authenticity, personal choice, the right to privacy, has widened into an unbridgeable chasm. Where once tradition itself provided sufficient warrant for the institution's continuation, that same tradition now appears antiquated, even absurd to a society that questions inherited hierarchies and challenges the notion that an accident of birth should determine one's station. The modern royal is caught between two irreconcilable worlds: the ceremonial expectations of an ancient office, and the reasonable human desires of a contemporary individual, making the prospect of accession less a coveted prize and more an elaborate gilded trap. The monarchy will no longer go on forever. For generations, those born into the royal line accepted their destiny with a sense of inevitability. Duty and obligation were not merely expectations, but the very foundation upon which their existence was built, a burden that came with the crown as naturally as breath itself. Yet across the decades, the public's reverence for this stoic acceptance has shifted dramatically, transforming from unwavering deference into something far more questioning and conditional. Where once citizens looked upon their monarchs with a faith that seemed almost religious in its conviction, modern society has subjected the institution to the same scrutiny it applies to all other pillars of power. Modernization has been relentless in its effects, stripping away the mystique that once insulated the royal family from the ordinary concerns that plague the rest of us. Today's courts must contend with instant communication, tabloid intrusion, and a populace increasingly sceptical of hereditary privilege. The weight of this transformation cannot be overstated. What was once an unquestionable calling, passed down through bloodlines with the certainty of law, has become something that demands justification, that must prove its worth in an era that no longer accepts that, because it has always been this way, constitutes a sufficient answer. The monarchy will no longer go on forever. The modern monarchy now faces pressures that would have been unimaginable to previous generations of sovereigns, thrust as they are into an era of relentless scrutiny and media exposure that leaves nowhere to hide, no corner of private life left untouched by the cameras and commentators eager to dissect every gesture and misstep. Where once the crown could govern largely beyond public view, maintaining an almost mythical distance that served to protect its authority, today's institutional demands for transparency and accountability have stripped away much of that mystique, forcing the monarchy to justify itself not merely through tradition or divine right, but through demonstrable service and moral clarity. Yet here lies the peculiar paradox. As society has become vastly more complex, with competing priorities fragmenting our attention, the climate crisis, economic inequality, technological disruption, countless urgent causes demanding royal patronage and intervention, the question that looms ever larger is whether the institution itself can remain relevant, or whether it will eventually buckle under the weight of expectations that no single family, however dutiful or well-intentioned, could reasonably fulfill. The institution that once seemed eternal, immovable as the very stones of Westminster Abbey, now finds itself perpetually on trial, forced to prove its worth in a world that no longer accepts unquestioned deference. The monarchy will no longer go on forever. Yet therein lies the fundamental paradox that threatens the institution's very survival. The crown, once the ultimate prize of power and ambition, has been systematically hollowed of the authority that made it worth pursuing. A modern monarch inherits not dominion, but decoration. Stripped of the absolute power that once justified the sacrifice, left instead with a ceremonial skeleton of what kingship once meant. The burden that remains is almost cruelly inverted. Where predecessors commanded nations, today's sovereigns are commanded by constitutional obligation, bound by duty to endless rounds of ribbon cuttings, state visits, and the suffocating machinery of protocol that transforms a human being into a breathing symbol. And the personal cost cuts deeper still. One must surrender privacy, autonomy, and the ordinary freedoms that define a life lived for oneself, exchanging them for a gilded cage of perpetual public service, where every gesture is scrutinized, every word weighed for diplomatic consequence, every moment of genuine solitude becomes a stolen luxury. Is it any wonder, then, that the prospect holds increasingly less appeal for the talented, ambitious individuals who might otherwise inherit the throne? The mathematics of the proposition have become untenable. Absolute power has gone, yet absolute sacrifice remains, and no rational person gazes upon such arithmetic and sees a bargain worth accepting. The monarchy will no longer go on forever. Yet perhaps the most telling sign of the monarchy's precarious position lies not in constitutional debates or political manoeuvring, but in the simple fact that fewer and fewer people seem to care whether it survives at all. Among younger generations particularly, there exists a palpable indifference where once there might have been reverence, a shrugging acceptance that this ancient institution, for all its pageantry and tradition, may no longer speak to the concerns of a modern, pluralistic society. The questions being asked are no longer about how the monarchy functions, but rather whether it needs to function at all, and whether the very concept of hereditary leadership, the idea that accident of birth should determine one's right to rule, remains anything more than an anachronistic curiosity in an age that has come to value meritocracy, however imperfectly. What was once unthinkable, that the British people might simply decide they had moved beyond the need for a monarchy altogether, has become, for an increasing number, not merely thinkable but almost inevitable, a quiet revolution of sentiment that requires no dramatic upheaval, only the passage of time and the gradual withdrawal of collective belief. The future of royal institutions. As the foundational questions about monarchical relevance persist, it becomes increasingly clear that the institution cannot simply drift along on the currents of tradition and historical momentum. The royal establishments of today face a stark choice: undergo potentially radical structural reforms or risk sliding into irrelevance. Some observers have proposed alternative governance models, perhaps a more streamlined court, a reframed constitutional role, or even a federation of regional monarchies with limited central authority. Yet none of these alternatives carry the weight of certainty that once seemed to buttress the institution. The monarchy might adapt, shedding the ceremonial excess and financial burdens that increasingly invite public scrutiny, embracing instead a leaner, more purposeful existence. Or it might simply calcify into museum piece status, preserved by law and sentiment but bereft of genuine power or relevance. The uncomfortable truth, however, is that adaptation itself demands a persuasive answer to the fundamental crisis at hand. In an age where we no longer accept the divine right of kings, nor the automatic deference of subjects, what precisely is the compelling reason for anyone to shoulder the burden of a crown? Without that answer, without a genuinely modern purpose that resonates beyond the pageantry, even the most thoughtful reforms may merely delay the reckoning rather than resolve it. The monarchy will no longer go on forever. The long-term viability of the British monarchy, once seemingly assured by centuries of tradition and constitutional entrenchment, now hinges upon a question that would have seemed unthinkable to previous generations. Why would anyone actually want the job? This fundamental shift in perception demands that the institution undergo necessary changes if it is to ensure its own continuation. For the weight of history alone can no longer sustain an institution that fails to answer why it deserves to exist in the modern world. The crown must evolve, whether through scaling back its ceremonial burdens, reimagining its political relevance, or redefining what it means to serve in an age of democratic skepticism, or risk becoming a relic that society eventually decides it can do without. The legacy of the monarchy, should it fail to adapt, will be measured not in the triumphs of its past, but in the cautionary tale of an institution that could not bend and therefore broke, leaving future generations to wonder what lasting impact it might have had if only it had been willing to change before change was forced upon it.